Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of October the 6th. So, watch this video, share it, subscribe, like, leave your comment below, and be active. Because today I'll be talking about I'll say, logistical fronts, which are rapidly opening right now in both directions, from Russians to Ukrainian logistical fronts, from Ukraine to Russia, deep strikes. So this kind of fronts, they are opening, as I said, quite rapidly right now, and this is the tendency of the last week and the week which we have entered in. And there is some perspective that those second line front or even third line front will be, in the short period of time, will be more active than zero front line. So I'll try to explain what I'm talking about right now during the next 20 or a little bit more minutes. So stay with us. Let's begin. Let's look at the deep state map to understand the geography of the recent strikes that were announced literally just the day before yesterday evening. There was a strike on Klintsy. Klintsy is right here in the Bryansk region, not far from the Ukrainian border. And it is highly likely that similar strikes on Klintsy and other border areas of the Russian Federation will target energy infrastructure. An eye for an eye. Yes, we can say a lot about how this might seem to us like an inadequate response to all the atrocities the Russians are committing against our energy sector. But let's wait. Let's go through everything step by step and chronologically break down what happened last night. There were reports that Belgorod was left without power and that the CHP plant in Klintsy was attacked. Klintsy undoubtedly supplies the western part of the Bryansk region. And Klintsy itself, such a strike on them was recorded. The video is short, but you can clearly see the local CHP plant in Klintsy burning brightly. The biggest attack last night was on Belgorod. I like that. People on social media have already started discussing that it should be renamed from Belgorod to Blackorod, saying it's so dark, Blackorod, where the light is completely destroyed, to be honest. Well, it does sound kind of funny, of course, but we're still a long way from that kind of trend, although Belgorod could be left without power every other day, in fact. Let's take a look at how it all happened. The strike itself, the very fact of the strike, and then how, symbolically, the lights went out in a large part of Nabila. Russian media began actively reporting that these attacks were carried out by HIMARS on the Luch gas turbine thermal power plant, which is not being attacked for the first time in Blackorod. And literally right after it was hit, the city lost power, which was even captured on video by eyewitnesses of the event. Let's take a look at this footage as well. Behind the family of buildings. Wow, the lights went out again. I've said it many times in my reviews. There's a huge emotional satisfaction. It's not just satisfaction, but a real demand among Ukrainians for the lights to go out in the Russian Federation, for their cities to be left without power like this. Of course, on an emotional level, for us, Belgorod, Klintsy, Bryansk, Rostov, Krasnodar Krai, Voronezh, Chekursk, for us, all of that won't be enough. We'll want more. We'll want Moscow to be left without power, for St. Petersburg to be left without power too. But I'm fully aware that there is a certain amount of resources at our disposal. I mean, in terms of long-range missiles and drones. And we have to use these resources wisely by targeting oil refineries, which has a very rapid impact on the Russian economy, and by hitting those frontline regions because they are of the greatest interest to us right now, not so much Moscow or St. Petersburg, but rather the frontline regions, because we need to drive people out of them, meaning the Russian occupiers. We need to turn these areas into a buffer zone that will prevent Russian occupiers from creating kill zones on our frontline territory. Because this factor of rear area warfare, which will soon, well, not even soon, it has in fact already started to reach 20, 30, 40, even 50 kilometers in. In many locations along our border, this is being felt. Sumy feels it, Chernihiv feels it, Kharkiv feels it, everyone feels it, even 40 kilometers in. So to prevent this, we need to push the front line, create a buffer zone on the territory of the Russian Federation deeper in the direction of the Russians, but it must be admitted that these rear area fronts that have opened up pose a very significant threat to us. It's truly a huge, simply gigantic threat. Just take a look at the statements that Naftogaz has been making recently. Yesterday on Sunday, during the night from Saturday to Sunday, Ukraine's gas infrastructure was subjected to massive attacks. There were hits, there was destruction. Before that, in the Poltava region, the gas infrastructure was also hit and damaged. And Naftogaz reported that just last week there were two in 1 week, the largest such attacks that have occurred since the start of the full-scale invasion. It must be acknowledged that in these cases, the enemy managed to break through our air defense because we are simply not able to cover everything. This is the objective reality. We also have gaps, and in principle, we cannot cover our entire airspace, just as the Russians cannot cover theirs. For example, there was a map circulating on monitors showing how last night, from Saturday to Sunday, the western regions, specifically Ivano-Frankivsk and Lviv regions, were attacked. Lviv region was under the main strike. And as you can see, it's simply impossible to counter this. It's simply impossible to get rid of all this, to counter all of it, especially when you have to operate constantly in a mode of limited resources and a shortage of missiles. In short, it's impossible. You can write 1,000 times, oh, Zelensky, where are our anti-aircraft missile systems? Where are our strike drones? And so on. But believe me, this work is being done. It's just that no one can counter such challenges, neither the Russians nor us. That's why the logic of combat dictates that these rear fronts will keep opening up more actively and deeper. And this trend is simply a technological one. It should have been anticipated and something should have been invented. Clearly, we haven't managed to come up with a solution yet, and apparently the Russians haven't figured out how to respond to this deep rear war either, which has undoubtedly now opened as a second front that exists in parallel with the front line. Because at the front, in terms of the entire line of contact, we're seeing, if not a stalemate, then at least we're trying to move towards stopping the enemy in those active sectors of the front where they're trying to push, specifically by using drone systems. By using drones, which by creating kill zones prevent the Russians from advancing deeper, but at the same time, I repeat, this creates a huge, simply gigantic problem for us. The Russian strikes on the border areas will create this problem. Yes, we can rejoice 10,000 times over their Belgorod, Kursk, or Bryansk, but they will respond symmetrically with strikes on our Kherson, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia. And we have not found a way to counter this. And frankly, this is surprising and raises questions about our technological progress. This is about technological foresight in war. What kind of countermeasures do we have? We are moving forward. Maybe I don't know something and we will soon see these solutions. I really hope so. But the fact is that the enemy has hit our energy sector very, very hard over the past week. That is simply an undeniable fact. In addition, the fact that the second rear front is becoming increasingly active, for example, there is the case of Kramatorsk, serves as evidence. Kramatorsk is a city that FPV drones couldn't reach before, but now they can. Here is a Radio Liberty correspondent, Serhiy Hobatenko, who was in Kramatorsk. Here he is in the photo. I'll show you this photo now, friends. So Serhiy Horbatenko showed how FPV drones, now connected via fiber optic, are reaching the rear city of Kramatorsk. This is our central location in the non-occupied part of Donbas, essentially our administrative center. The part of Donbas that remains under the control of the Ukrainian government. Well, here's what Horbatenko himself says about this discovery, so to speak. Kramatorsk, fiber optics, this is something very new and very unpleasant. You can't say that this is something completely new or that it's the very first strike on Kramatorsk in history. Unfortunately, drones with fiber optic connections are able to approach and reach Kramatorsk. Here's one of the videos from enemy public channels showing a vehicle being hit in Kramatorsk. Honestly, it looks really bad, very comfortable for them. The drone flies around, strikes, waits, and searches for vehicles. They target vehicles that seem to them like they could be military, and they strike at them. It might actually be a military vehicle, but the very fact that drones are already flying into Kramatorsk is a very, very bad trend, and it will only continue. I don't know what we're going to do about these FPV drones that are hitting our border areas. I can only say very generally that, as far as I know, countermeasures are being developed, but we can't keep up. And this mode of technological warfare, honestly, neither we nor the Russians are able to keep up with it. Here, we need very resourceful and serious involvement from our Western partners, who really need to grasp and understand what is happening and where things are heading, and by what methods we can, by significantly reducing the cost of combat means, actually achieve results and counter these cheap means. Because essentially, an FPV drone is an extremely cheap method. Everything is moving towards cost reduction. Absolutely everything is becoming cheaper. And we need to find ways to counter this, because otherwise the enemy will simply turn our frontline cities into a nightmare, just as they are doing with Kherson. For example, here's another case. By the way, this is about the fiber optic guided drone, another incident like in Kherson, where the Russians simply struck a civilian who was just walking through the city. Well, and this terrorism will continue, and unfortunately it will spread to more cities. And it's an obvious reality. The person wasn't walking, the person wasn't driving a civilian car, it was a civilian car. They believe that anyone moving under the Ukrainian flag, roughly speaking, or with Ukrainian license plates is an enemy to them. And they kill everyone, all civilians, indiscriminately, without exception, both civilians and military personnel. And accordingly, well, this trend is just, damn it, seriously troubling. Yes, I'll repeat it again. We strike Belgorod, we strike Bryansk region, we try to act eye for an eye, but this is not the kind of symmetry that can work for us. We have to anticipate a technological war in advance. In short, I said a lot, but I hope you caught my main point. By the way, it's worth noting that those regions that are relatively in the rear, well, yes, there has been a huge debate recently about Chernihiv, which lets a lot of Shaheds pass deep into its territory. I've also heard from energy specialists that some facilities in Chernihiv, to put it mildly, were not the best prepared for the heating season in terms of protection against enemy drones that are flying there. That is, it's clear that objectively the main preparation, the main countermeasure is to have a quality air defense system. So there's also the question of why in some regions, like Sumy region, which borders Chernihiv region, I'm just relaying what the discussions are about, why in Sumy region Shaheds are being shot down effectively and actively, literally as soon as they enter our airspace. But in Chernihiv region, this isn't happening. It's a very big question. Why? Why in relatively calm regions does little get done and action only happens when, as they say, the roasted rooster pecks you in the backside? In fact, this is about how drones are actively being shot down on the front line, in the frontline zone. The 7th Corps of the Air Assault Forces, which is holding the defense near Krovsky and Mirnohrad, reports on this. In a statement from the 7th Corps published at the end of last week, it was said that compared to August, in September they shot down 50% more Shaheds while working on the front than they did in August. So, for some reason, I think the logic is clear, I hope. For some reason, people on the front are more effective than those who remain deep in the rear. This is especially a question for officials. For some reason, those in the rear feel more comfortable for a longer time, but then when the avalanche comes down on them, they start running around not knowing how to cover their own backsides, even though they could have prepared for this in advance. On the front, people know in advance how to counteract, and we need to adopt this experience from them. But let's return to the work of the 7th Air Assault Corps in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. Our paratroopers also stated that during September, in this zone, they managed to neutralize 1,851 occupiers, of which 1,200 were irrecoverable losses. This is roughly 1.5 to 2, or even 2.5 times less than the figures on the northern flank of the Pokrovsk-Dobropilia defensive direction, where there were statements that over 3,000 Russian soldiers were eliminated in just the month of September during the operation to counter the breakthrough of Russian troops. Well, but let me tell you, taking 1,800 into account, the number of killed and wounded just in this area alone, those are also very, very high figures. I mean, the Russians still don't spare their own meat to send it to slaughter. Even Russian propagandists have started posting about this. There's this guy Romanov, for example, who recently wrote an interesting little note. Let's read it together. Why are there not enough assault troops? And Romanov explains why. Because the average life cycle of an assault unit is 12 days. This is for an assault. This is for an assault soldier. 12 days, writes a Russian propagandist. Russian assault troops live 12 days. Day 1, he signs the contract and arrives at the training ground. Days 2 through 11, training at the training ground, so the training lasts 9 days. Day 12, the last one, deployment to positions, what they call deployment to positions. Kolodets, they pour something, some kind of kolodets, they pour it in. Well, they treat people something like kolodets, deployment to positions in hot areas. Out of 2 fighters, one reaches the position at best, 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 at best. A scenario that can unfold for the Russians if we're talking about positions, that is where, so that, and two more, one reaches. Well, that's not really true information at all, but he's talking about a specific and detailed 12-day cycle, the entire complete operational life cycle of an assault trooper from their initial training and deployment all the way through to their eventual decommissioning or replacement. Russian. And this is exactly what our paratroopers who are holding the defense are talking about, very heavy losses in enemy personnel. If we talk specifically about the directions, today, by the way, I want to emphasize the rear war and the situation near Pokrovsk, because these are essentially the two most critical issues, even though we have other not rear, but frontline locations, such as the Novopavlivka direction, the Liman front, and the Kupiansk area. We pay attention to them every time, but today I won't. However, in the next map reviews, I will definitely cover them. So what are our paratroopers saying? The Russians are attacking from the direction of Zvirove, and on the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, they are being held back. Right now, there are enemy troops attacking from Zvirov. At the same time, our paratroopers also acknowledge that there is now a greater threat of cutting off logistical routes from the western direction. That is from the Yudakhny area. As was mentioned earlier, the enemy has advanced there. The Russians are also pressing from the direction of Novoekonomishny, from the east and north of the Krasny Lyman and Rodinsky area towards Mirnohrad. There are no enemy forces in the city of Mirnohrad, meaning they have not entered here. Overall, they are trying to isolate this section of the front, which serves as our logistics routes are from Pokrovsk to Mirnohrad. They are trying to cut it off by creating their own kill zones. By the way, now, I suggest we take a look at the map from the French Center, which I often refer to for services and analysis. Kliman Molen meticulously created this particular kind of thermal image, if you can truly call it that, clearly showing the devastating Russian airstrikes in the significant Pokrovsk area and also the broader area situated north of Dobropilsky, so to speak, in that general direction. So here's the crucial thing. Let's now bring up this important map, my dear friends, and I will endeavor to explain in detail what the various legends on this comprehensive map actually mean. Let's identify two main defensive points in the Pokrovsk-Dobropilsky direction that we need to understand. These are Pokrovsky and Shakhove. What makes them so special? Well, first of all, Pokrovsk, and you can see a red ellipse outlined near my image on the...
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Video. It's, let's say, an ellipse like that. Shows the intensity of enemy strikes in the section of the front that I just highlighted with the black square. Let's return to the deep state map. This is the area where the logistics for Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad are maintained, and it is precisely there that the highest intensity of enemy strikes was recorded during September. So this is location number one, where they are striking, and without a doubt, the main point of defense in this regard is Pokrovsk. Now, location number two, let's look at the map again. This is Shakhov. Here as well, you can see such white dots. There are a great many of them. The main focus of the enemy is precisely on the area of the settlement of Shakhov. If we go back to the maps, we'll understand why this is so, because here, just like in Pokrovsk, but on a scale about 3 times smaller, what is essentially a months-long holding of a forward outpost position by Ukrainian forces is taking place. This is Shakhov. The Russians tried to bypass it from the direction of Kucheryav Yar, and now they are trying to bypass it from the direction of Popov Yar and Poltavka to encircle it, but they have not succeeded in surrounding this position. So instead, they are simply with all these dots, and you could draw hundreds here. They are trying as much as possible to destroy these positions of our defense using their aviation. That's why the greatest attention in the near future is focused on the logistics of Pokrovsk and Shakhove. So in fact, here is your prediction. I said we would talk about certain predictions or feelings about what should happen this week, and this is what should happen this week. That is, the enemy will try to target the logistics of Pokrovsk and Shakhov, and this is a trend not only for the coming week, but for the near future as well. Well, over a certain period of time, this is what the enemy will try to do here, and we ultimately need to understand that. Shakhov in the northern Pokrovsk direction, or Dobropilska in the Kostiantinivka direction, it has, well, if not decisive, then at least significant importance. And that's why, friends, I urge you to pay very close attention specifically to this settlement. Although finally, according to the statistics from Kliman Malenov, that French analyst whose map I just showed, there is also some positive information. for some reason, the Russians have started using significantly fewer airstrikes in such attacks on the front line. There were 938 strikes recorded in September. That's actually more than twice less than what was recorded in August. In August, there were 1,917 strikes, while in September, there were 938. What is the reason for this? I'm not sure that this is due to any significant improvement in the range capabilities of our air defense systems, although we have already had an incident where we shot down an enemy Kaby carrier in Zaporizhia, I should remind you. Perhaps it's looking ahead, the Russians also seem to understand that they shouldn't use it this way anymore. But I wouldn't rush to celebrate, because I've already voiced this version before. The Russians have started switching Shaheds to direct radio control mode with a camera, as we know, and are using them in frontline areas. And in the future, this could become a replacement for the Kaby. Aviation that is wearing out, aviation that will be shot down. Instead, they will be replaced by Shaheds in large numbers, which with a 50-kilogram warhead will strike positions in the frontline areas. And once again, as I wrap up this review today, I'll pose this rhetorical question. What exactly do you want to hear? We are doing this so that, and it was already clear, you could see it with the naked eye back in April of this year, even without having all the intelligence data, that this is exactly how things would turn out. How are we defending ourselves? When it comes to Shaheds, I more or less understand how we can defend ourselves. But how are we going to defend ourselves against FPV drones, which are increasing their range and now reaching as far as Kramatorsk? So far, unfortunately, I don't see an answer to this question. And this is a very serious issue because the rear front is being targeted more and more actively, and it is quite possible that soon it will be even more active than before. That's how things are, friends. Thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.